Since I made the decision to ditch small square bales and go full speed ahead on round bales, that has meant a couple of things for me. Number one, it means that I will no longer have to throw around small squares, and this actually is a good thing because it's gonna save my back in the long run. And the older I get, the more that self-preservation kind of just sounds like a good idea. The other side of this though is that now I'm gonna be heavily dependent on equipment. Just by the sheer size of round bales, there's no way that I can pick them up and move them by hand. So I'm gonna be depending 100% on my tractors and equipment to move the bales around. That means that I really need this stuff to be dependable and reliable. So I'm trying to go through this thing and make a few, not necessarily upgrades, but just sort of go through and refurbish things, try to get this thing back into fighting condition, and hopefully she's not gonna let me down. That's what we're doing today on Farmer Tyler Ranch. I have already done a few things to this tractor off camera, and I decided not to film a lot of the stuff that I've done so far because I've already made videos about doing the same kinds of things to my Jubilee, which is a very similar tractor to this. Just so we're on the same page, let's walk around the tractor and I'll sort of point out all the things that I've done up to this point. The first thing at the front of the tractor are these new ball joints. The ones that were on the tractor when I got it were totally shot. They probably had maybe 3/4 of an inch of play in there, and that just wasn't gonna work. You may also notice that there's new bolts here in the front axle, and the reason for that is I flipped the wheels back around the correct way, and I widened the axle to get the track width the same as the rear. I wanted the front axle to stay wide like that because with the loader you want that extra stability, but I didn't want the wheels to be on there backwards like they were before because it was making steering very difficult. And as long as we're talking about the wheels, I'm sure you've noticed that both wheels have new front tires. I went through the front axle and replaced the bushings in this tube and the thrust bearing that's down here at the bottom as well. I pretty much replaced every electrical component on this tractor and completely rewired it. And in the process of doing all that, I upgraded it to a 12-volt system. All of these new parts that I just showed you on the tractor were paid for with Patreon funds. So I want to take a minute and thank all of you guys who donated on Patreon. If you've ever wondered where your money goes, you're looking at it. So while I have got a lot done to this tractor, there's still a lot more that I need to do before I'm really going to feel like I can trust it. And tonight, the first thing at the top of that list is front wheel bearings. If you've done a job like this before, then you know that on the end of this spindle there's a castle nut and a cotter pin. If you haven't done this before and you don't know that, you might not be able to know just by looking at it because there's so much grease on there, sometimes it can be hard to spot. We're free now. From here on out, I'm gonna go through a lot of paper towels because everything I touch is gonna get my hands very greasy, and I'm having to operate cameras too, so I don't wanna get grease all over my camera. Now I can just pull the rest of this apart and try not to lose the pieces, although most of this won't be reused. With the castle nut and the washer removed, the next thing I can get here is, well, I can get the whole thing really, but I'm gonna just kind of take it piece by piece and show you guys. So there's a smaller bearing that goes on the outside. Now we can pull this whole hub off of here and the inner bearing is still in the hub. So we're gonna take this back up to the workbench, and I'll pop the seal out so that I can get the old bearing out. What's handy about these hubs is that the hub itself protrudes out further than the studs do. So I can lay the hub down flat on the workbench like this, and I'll put a couple C-clamps here to hold it, and I don't have to worry about messing up those studs. So hopefully this is just a matter, oh yeah. Of that. Nothing to it. With that seal removed, the bearing should just pop right out. I'm sure it's not really going to translate on camera as to how much old nasty grease is in this hub, but there's a lot, and it's probably honestly not really hurting anything inside the hub the way it is, but I am going to go ahead and just try to wipe as much of it out as I can, knowing that I won't get all of it. But I still need to get these bearing races out of here. And there's actually kind of a, well, not a trick, but I guess a neat thing that the engineers left here for the mechanic that would in the future be replacing these bearings. I was just going through way too many paper towels trying to wipe all the grease out of there, and it just kind of felt like I was getting nowhere. So I'm gonna go ahead and soak this hub in diesel, and we'll come back to it after it's soaked for a little while, and hopefully it'll be easier for me to clean. All right, fast forward to the next day. This hub has had a chance to sit in the diesel overnight, so I'm hoping that all of that grease is dissolved now and we can clean it up a little bit easier. All right, that hub is starting to look pretty good. We definitely don't have every speck of grease out of there, but we really don't need it to be clean enough to eat off of because we're just gonna be putting new grease back in there. But the reason that I wanted to get a bunch of that old grease out, for one, is because a lot of it has been contaminated with dirt and water over the years. And for two, it's gonna make it easier to pound these old races out. And let me show you what I'm talking about. As we look in the hub here, you can see on the hole on the other side, there's a notch on the top and on the bottom. Now what these notches are for is it's a spot that you can get a punch in there to drive these races out. Now the notches are on both sides, but it's only really easy to see on this side, so that's why I'm showing it to you there. So all that I'm gonna have to do is just take a punch that's long enough to reach here and find those notches, and this thing will just tap right out. And what you have to do here is just kind of give it one hit on one side and then come back and give it a hit on the other side. And just keep alternating back and forth like that. And eventually, it'll work itself loose. Now this race has been driven out to the end of the hub here, so obviously we can't be pounding down on the table anymore because the table is going to prevent the race from coming out. So what you can do is rig up something with spacers. At this point, the race is loose enough that I can just put it in this little vise here. I'm not going to have to pound it too hard, so I can do that without damaging the hub, and we'll get this the rest of the way out. There's one. The big race on the inside of the hub comes out the exact same way as the small race on the outside of the hub did. And again, they give you those notches so that you have a place to get your punch in there. You can just pound it out. Sound like we bottomed out there. There we go. Now that we've got this hub fully disassembled, I'll give it one more wipe down and then we can start reinstalling the new parts. I left these races in the freezer overnight so that the cold temperature would cause the steel to shrink just a little bit, and that's gonna help ease the installation, or so they say. We'll get this guy kind of started here, and I can almost just push it in by hand, so that little freezer trick works pretty good. I'm going to use a socket to drive this in. It's a pretty handy way to do this actually, and you know you have a bunch of different sizes that you can use for drivers. So this 1 13/16 is going to be the perfect size for this race. So it should just tap right in here pretty easily. All right, that side went right in with no problem, so we'll just flip the hub over, do the same thing on the other side. This side of the hub has these threads here for the little hubcap. So with your driver, you want to make sure that you got plenty of room here so that you're not screwing those up. Now we're ready to pack our bearings and reassemble the hub and throw it on the spindle here. But before we do that, I want to take a minute and wipe all this old grease off of the spindle, because as you can see, this thing's pretty nasty looking. And when I put this all back together, I'm gonna feel a lot better if I just know that it's all fresh new grease, and that's what we're gonna do. Now we got the spindle cleaned up here, I'm actually pretty disappointed in the shape that it's in. You can see that this metal in between where the bearings go is pretty pitted, and I don't know if we got some water in there or what happened to corrode it like that. Where the bearings are gonna ride here is in good shape still, so that's good. But this is probably something that I'm gonna wanna replace before I really start working this tractor too hard. Just because I kind of question the strength here. I mean, it's a 70-year-old tractor. You kind of got to expect things like that to happen. For what we're doing today though, this is fine. We can go ahead and put this back together so that we can take this thing for a test drive. Now it's time to pack the bearings with grease, and what I'm using is this Bale waterproof grease, because I know that we're going to be in mud and water and everything else in this tractor, so I think this stuff should work pretty good. You guys don't see me wear gloves often on this channel because I don't like losing the feel, but this is a job where normally I would wear gloves, but wouldn't you know, I'm out of gloves. So we're just gonna have to go right in. Last thing before we put the hub on the spindle is we need to put this rubber seal here on the back side of the hub. These seals are not really exactly like the ones that came out from the factory. The ones from the factory would have had a metal rim on one side, and that made it a little bit easier to know how these go in, because the metal rim, I believe, goes down. Okay, after a quick little bit of research, I determined that they say the metal part of the seal goes towards the bearing. So if this did have metal on it, I feel like it would have to be on this flat side. So I think we're gonna put these in like that. Again, I'm gonna use a socket to drive this seal in, and a 2-inch socket seems to fit that thing pretty good. And it's a good thing, because this is the biggest socket that I have, so it's gonna work though.
Right there.
Getting pretty close to good. Perfect. So now we're going to put this spindle nut on, and when you're dealing with wheel bearings like this, there's a few different schools of thought, I guess, on how tight to get this. The way that I like to do it, or the way that I was taught to do it by somebody that I think probably knew what he was talking about, is you just kind of want to spin the hub and tighten this nut a little bit. And when you get to the point where you start to feel resistance, that's where you stop and put the cotter pin in and you're done. I've also heard that when you feel resistance, you should back off a quarter turn, but what I was told is that on something that's going to see a lot of loads, such as a tractor with a loader or an equipment carrier, that you want those bearings a little bit tighter like that. So that's the way I've always done it, and it seems to work just fine. All right, well, that is gonna do it for wheel bearings. It's actually a pretty easy job. Now I wanna pull this tractor out of the shop and I wanna take the bucket off. Couple reasons. One, I just want to give it a test drive with the new wheel bearings and all the new steering components, because when I first got the tractor home, it was very hard to steer. But I think with all the upgrades that I've made here, that should help that. So I want to test it out there, and I want to get this bucket off because it's time for me to start my next project with this tractor. And once I get the bucket off, I'm going to show you what that is. Now, it doesn't get much better than that as far as just firing right up. Well, that test drive went very well. This motor is running just as smooth as silk now, and the steering is vastly improved. But now that we've got the tractor back in the shop and the bucket's off, let me show you guys a little peek at what's coming next. Yes, it is time to build a Bale spear for the front loader on this tractor. Now, my final design almost certainly won't be this because this just doesn't look strong enough to me, but I need to look around a little bit more and see what other people have done. If you guys have a Bale spear on the front of your tractor that you really like, please email me a picture because I would like to get some ideas of how to make this right the first time. Thanks for hanging out in the shop with me today, guys, and I hope I'll see you again on Farmer Tyler Ranch.